Tyler Reeves was 11 years old, and he loved his school more than almost anything else in the world, especially the small community garden behind the gymnasium that he and his classmates had been growing since September. Rows of tomatoes and peppers, and a stubborn patch of sunflowers that the 5th grade had planted with their own hands during the first week after summer break, back when the soil was still hard and dry, and Mrs. Foster, their science teacher, had told them that patience was the only ingredient that mattered in gardening, because everything else could be bought at a store, but patience had to be grown inside a person, the same way a seed had to be grown inside the ground. Tyler had taken that lesson more seriously than any of his classmates, and every day during recess, while the other kids ran across the blacktop chasing a battered kickball, or clustered near the swings trading cards and stories, Tyler would slip away to the garden with a small spiral notebook tucked under his arm, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, sketching the way the tomato leaves curled at their edges, or the way the sunflowers turned their heavy heads toward whatever patch of sky held the most light that afternoon. And he did this not because he disliked his classmates, but because something about the quiet focus of drawing made the noise of the world settle down inside him, made the constant hum of being 11 and unsure of everything feel, for 20 minutes at a time, perfectly still. His mother, Angela, worked long shifts as a hospital administrator, and often told him he had the patience of someone twice his age. And his father, though he worked even longer hours, and Tyler rarely saw him during the week, had once looked through that same notebook on a rare Sunday morning and told him that a man who could sit still and pay attention to something small was a man who would notice things that mattered later in life. A comment Tyler did not fully understand at the time, but which he carried with him anyway, tucked somewhere in the back of his mind, the way a person carries advice they suspect will matter someday, even if they cannot yet say why. Lincoln Elementary sat in a modest, working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city. A building with faded brick and hallways that smelled faintly of floor wax and cafeteria food. And it had, until that October, never had a permanent police presence beyond the occasional visit from a community liaison officer who came twice a year to talk about bicycle safety and stranger danger in an assembly that half the students slept through. That changed when the district superintendent, responding to pressure after an unrelated incident at a middle school across town, rolled out a new school resource officer initiative, assigning uniformed officers to elementary and middle schools throughout the district on a rotating basis. A decision that was debated at length in parent meetings that Tyler's mother attended and voiced quiet concerns about, though ultimately the program moved forward as these things often do, driven by budget lines and political optics more than by the day-to-day reality of what it would mean for a building full of 10 and 11-year-olds to suddenly have an armed adult stranger walking their halls every single day. The officer assigned to Lincoln Elementary was a man named Craig Nolan, 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with a crew cut going gray at the temples, and a voice that carried without effort. The kind of voice built over 2 decades of shouting instructions across parking lots and street corners in a rougher precinct on the other side of the city. A precinct he had requested transfer out of after an internal complaint that never quite became a formal disciplinary action, but had followed him quietly through his personnel file all the same, the details of which no one at Lincoln Elementary knew anything about, because these things rarely traveled with the paperwork the way they should have. Nolan had grown up believing, in the plain and unshakable way some people believe things without ever examining them, that respect was something owed automatically to a badge and a uniform, and that any child who did not immediately offer that respect, who hesitated or looked away or, worse, seemed indifferent to his presence, was a child on the wrong path, a child who needed, as he liked to put it to anyone who would listen, a wake-up call before it was too late. He said this kind of thing often in the break room at his old precinct, and he said it again during his first week at Lincoln Elementary to a teacher's aide named Renata Cole, who nodded politely and said nothing, because she had learned in her own quiet 20 years working in public schools that men who talked that way rarely wanted to be corrected, only agreed with, and she had neither the energy nor the standing to be the one who tried. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in the middle of October, the kind of late autumn day where the sun still felt like summer, even though the leaves on the maple trees lining the playground fence had already begun to turn the color of rust. When Officer Nolan was walking the perimeter of the building during the 5th grade's afternoon recess, a duty he performed less out of any specific safety concern and more out of a restless need to be seen doing something, to be visibly present and visibly in charge. A habit that had served him well in his old assignment, where visibility was often the entire job. He rounded the corner of the gymnasium and spotted Tyler sitting alone near the garden beds, exactly where Tyler sat most days at this hour, notebook open on his knees, pencil moving in small, careful strokes, as he tried to capture the particular slouch of a tomato plant that had grown too heavy for its stake, and now leaned sideways in a way that Tyler found, for reasons he could not have articulated, quietly beautiful. Something about the sight irritated Nolan immediately, though if pressed, he could not have said exactly why, only that there was something about a child sitting alone and quiet and absorbed in something private that struck him in that instant as suspicious rather than simply peaceful, an old and unexamined instinct from years of being trained to read isolation as a warning sign, rather than as what it usually actually was, which was nothing at all. He crossed the grass toward Tyler with the deliberate, heavy-footed walk of a man who wanted to be heard coming, and by the time his shadow fell across the notebook, Tyler had already looked up, startled, his pencil freezing mid-stroke against the page. Nolan asked him, in a voice pitched loud enough that it carried across the playground and drew the attention of a cluster of 4th graders playing tag nearby, what exactly he thought he was hiding in that notebook. And Tyler, blinking up at him with the particular confusion of a child who has done nothing wrong and cannot understand why an adult is speaking to him as though he has. Tried to explain that it was nothing, just drawings of the garden for a class project, Mrs. Foster had assigned, but he had barely gotten 3 words into the sentence when Nolan reached down and pulled the notebook out of his hands with a sharp, careless motion. The kind of motion a person makes when they have already decided what they are going to find before they have looked. He flipped through the pages roughly, thumbing past sketch after sketch of tomato leaves and sunflower heads, and one careful drawing of the whole garden bed from above, tearing one page slightly at the spiral binding in the process, a small sound that made Tyler flinch as though he had been struck. And then Nolan straightened up, held the notebook out toward the small crowd of children who had begun to gather at the edge of the blacktop, drawn by the sound of a raised voice, and announced, loud enough for all of them to hear, that this was exactly the kind of behavior that led to trouble down the road. Kids who sat off by themselves, scribbling secrets in notebooks instead of playing like normal children. Kids who needed to learn that hiding things from the adults around them never ended well. Tyler's eyes filled with tears, hot and fast, and humiliating in the way that only a child's tears can be humiliating, precisely because they arrive before the child has any say in the matter. And he reached up for his notebook, asking quietly, "Please, could he have it back?" But Nolan held it above his head, well out of reach of an 11-year-old, and told him with a short, dismissive laugh that if he wanted it back, he was going to have to learn to speak up like a man instead of hiding behind a piece of paper. A comment that drew a nervous ripple of laughter from a couple of the older boys standing at the edge of the crowd. The kind of laughter children produce not because something is funny, but because they do not know what else to do when an adult with authority has decided to make an example of someone. A teacher's aide, a young woman named Priya Anand, who had been supervising recess from near the swings, hurried over when she saw the crowd gathering and the look on Tyler's face, and she tried gently to intervene, suggesting that perhaps the notebook could be returned and they could all get back to recess. But Nolan waved her off, without even fully turning to look at her, saying this was a teaching moment and he had it handled. And Priya, 26 years old and less than a year into her position, hesitated, unsure of her authority to override a uniformed police officer in front of 30 watching children. And in that hesitation, the moment stretched on a few seconds longer than it should have. Seconds that Tyler would remember far more vividly than anything that happened afterward. The seconds when no adult stepped in, and the whole world seemed to consist only of Officer Nolan's raised arm and his own 2 empty hands reaching uselessly upward. It was in the middle of this scene, this small, ugly, entirely unnecessary humiliation of a child over a spiral notebook full of tomato plants, that Principal Diane Whitfield came around the corner of the gymnasium, drawn by the noise, walking briskly with a folder tucked under one arm, and beside her, in a crisp navy uniform with the twin bars of a police chief pinned neatly to each shoulder, walked a tall man with close-cropped hair and a calm, measured way of moving that seemed to command a room without any effort at all. There because he had a scheduled visit that afternoon to walk the building and observe firsthand how the new school resource officer program he personally oversaw was actually functioning on the ground. A detail no one at Lincoln Elementary had known in advance, because Chief Marcus Reeves preferred, whenever possible, to see things as they actually were, rather than as they were staged to appear for his benefit. The moment Tyler saw him, something in his chest broke open. Relief and shame tangled together so tightly he could not tell them apart, and he called out, in a voice thick with tears, the single word, "Dad," loud enough that it carried clearly across the sudden silence that had fallen over the playground, and every head turned first toward the boy and then toward the man in the chief's uniform standing beside the principal, and then, slowly, with a kind of dawning horror that seemed to drain the color out of his face in real time, toward Officer Nolan, who still stood there with a torn notebook raised above a crying child's head, only now understanding, with the sick clarity of a man watching his own mistake assemble itself in front of him, that the boy he had just humiliated in front of 30 classmates was the son of the very chief of police who ran his entire department. Chief Reeves did not raise his voice. He crossed the distance between them in a handful of long, unhurried strides. And the first thing he did, before he said a single word to Officer Nolan, was reach out and gently take the notebook from his hand, not snatching it the way Nolan had snatched it from Tyler, but simply receiving it, the way a person receives something fragile that has been mishandled. And then he crouched down to his son's level, one knee in the dirt of the garden bed, without any apparent concern for his pressed uniform trousers, and asked Tyler quietly, just between the two of them, though the whole playground could still hear, if he was all right. And only once Tyler had nodded, wiping at his face with the back of his sleeve, did the chief stand back up and turn slowly to face Officer Nolan directly. What followed was not shouting, and in its own way that made it far more unsettling to everyone watching than shouting would have been, because Chief Reeves's voice remained level and controlled the entire time. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that real authority never needed volume to make itself felt. He asked Nolan plainly to explain what department policy, what training, what possible justification existed for tearing a page out of a child's sketchbook in front of his classmates. And Nolan, his composure entirely gone now, stammered that he hadn't known, that there was no way he could have known who the boy was, as though not knowing were somehow an excuse rather than the entire point. And Chief Reeves let a long, heavy silence sit in the air before he answered, telling him, in front of the principal, the teacher's aide, and every child still gathered at the edge of the blacktop, that not knowing was never going to be an acceptable excuse for how any officer treated any child, whether that child happened to be his own son or a stranger he would never see again in his life, and that the badge on Nolan's chest did not exist to make an 11-year-old feel small over a drawing of a tomato plant. He told him that respect, if it meant anything at all, had to run in both directions, from the badge to the child, just as much as from the child to the badge, and that an officer who could not understand that distinction had no business standing in a school hallway wearing a uniform that children were supposed to be able to trust. Principal Whitfield, visibly shaken by what she had just witnessed on school grounds, asked Nolan to report to her office immediately, and within the hour, the district's safety coordinator had been called. And by the end of the week, Officer Craig Nolan had been formally reassigned out of the School Resource Officer Program entirely, pending a review that would eventually surface, buried in an old and half-forgotten personnel file. The details of that earlier complaint from his previous precinct that had never quite become anything on paper, but which suddenly, in light of what had happened at Lincoln Elementary, looked a great deal less like an isolated incident, and a great deal more like a pattern that no one had ever bothered to properly examine. The district, for its part, launched a full review of how officers assigned to elementary schools were trained to interact with young children, bringing in child psychologists and veteran educators to help redesign a program that had, until that October afternoon, apparently assumed that the instincts an officer developed patrolling city streets would translate cleanly and safely into a building full of 10 and 11-year-olds. An assumption that Tyler's torn notebook had proven, in the most public and painful way possible, to be badly mistaken. What people in the neighborhood talked about most in the weeks that followed, though, was not the policy review or the reassignment memo or any of the bureaucratic aftermath that unfolded quietly in district offices, but a short video that Renata Cole, the teacher's aide who had said nothing during Nolan's first week out of a sense that correcting him was not her place, had quietly recorded on her phone from the classroom doorway the moment she realized what was unfolding on the playground. A video that showed, in 26 unedited seconds, a boy crying alone in front of his classmates over a piece of paper, and then a father crossing the grass without raising his voice, kneeling in the dirt beside his son before he said a single word to anyone else, and reminding in that quiet, unhurried, entirely unforgettable way an entire police department that real authority was never supposed to feel like fear, especially not to a child, and especially not over something as small and as did. Innocent as a drawing of a tomato plant leaning sideways in the October sun. In the months that followed, Tyler kept the notebook, torn page and all, refusing his mother's offer to buy him a new one, telling her simply that he wanted to remember what it looked like when someone stood up for him without needing to shout. And every afternoon during recess, he could still be found in the same spot near the garden, sketching whatever caught his eye that day, though now, more often than not, Priya Anand made a quiet point of walking past that corner of the playground a little more often than her duties strictly required. Not because anyone had told her to, but because she had learned in the space of one October afternoon exactly how much difference it made when an adult chose to step in rather than step back. And she had decided, privately and without any need to announce it to anyone, that she was never again going to let that hesitation win. To understand fully why that October afternoon unfolded the way it did, it helped to understand where Officer Craig Nolan had come from. Because a man does not arrive at the point of tearing a page from a child's notebook out of nowhere. He arrives there through years of small, uncorrected habits that no one along the way had ever forced him to examine. And Nolan's path to Lincoln Elementary had been paved with exactly that kind of quiet, accumulated permission. He had spent 19 years working patrol in a precinct on the industrial side of the city, a district with high call volume and low staffing, the kind of assignment that wears a certain groove into an officer's instincts over time, teaching him to read every hesitation as a threat and every silence as something to be broken rather than respected. And in that environment, surrounded by colleagues who had learned the same lessons the same way, Nolan's particular style of loud, physically imposing control had never once been questioned, had in fact been quietly rewarded, praised by supervisors who valued the appearance of command more than they valued the substance of it. 2 years before he transferred to the school resource program, an incident had occurred that never made the news and never resulted in formal discipline, though it lived on in a file that almost no one ever opened. An encounter during a routine call in which Nolan had detained a 15-year-old boy for what turned out to be nothing more than standing on a corner after dark, waiting for his older sister to pick him up from a study group. An encounter that had escalated, according to the boy's mother's complaint, because Nolan had grabbed the teenager by the arm hard enough to leave a bruise and refused to let go, even after the boy had answered every question calmly, and even after his identification confirmed he had done nothing wrong. The complaint had been logged. A supervisor had spoken to Nolan briefly in a conversation that lasted perhaps 10 minutes and ended with a handshake and a reminder to be more careful. And the file had then been closed and filed away, not because anyone had determined the complaint was false, but because, in a department stretched thin across a large and difficult district, a single unverified complaint against a 19-year veteran rarely amounted to more than a line in a folder that nobody expected to matter again. When Nolan requested a transfer out of that precinct the following year, citing simple burnout after 2 decades on the same beat, no one connected the timing to the complaint, and no one flagged his file for additional scrutiny when the new school resource officer assignments were being distributed, because the system that was supposed to catch this kind of pattern had never actually been designed to look for patterns at all. only for formal findings. And a formal finding was exactly the kind of paperwork that a 10-minute hallway conversation and a handshake had been specifically built to avoid. This was the file, thin and unremarkable on its surface, that suddenly took on an entirely different weight in the days after the incident on the Lincoln Elementary playground, when a records clerk in the department's Internal Affairs Division, prompted by Chief Reeves's direct order to review Nolan's complete history rather than simply the events of that Tuesday afternoon, pulled the old complaint from the archive and found herself reading, with a sinking recognition, a description of the exact same pattern that had just played out in front of 30 fifth graders and a father who happened to outrank everyone involved. The same instinct to escalate rather than de-escalate. The same refusal to release physical control once he had established it. The same inability, when questioned afterward, to explain his actions with anything more substantial than a shrug and an insistence that he had simply been doing his job. The disciplinary hearing that followed, 3 weeks after the playground incident, was not open to the public. But Chief Reeves, breaking with the department's usual practice of keeping such proceedings entirely behind closed doors, insisted that a written summary of the findings be released to the community. A decision he later explained, in a brief statement to local reporters, by saying that a department that asked the public to trust it could not simultaneously ask that same public to take that trust on faith without ever seeing the evidence behind it. During the hearing itself, Nolan sat across a long conference table from a 3-person review panel that included a retired judge, a child welfare advocate from the district's family services office, and a captain from an entirely different precinct, brought in specifically to avoid any appearance that colleagues were protecting one of their own. And when asked directly why he had grabbed the notebook out of an 11-year-old's hands, rather than simply asking to see it, Nolan's answer, delivered without much apparent self-awareness, was that the boy's quiet, withdrawn manner had made him uneasy. That in his experience, children who kept to themselves and hid things in notebooks were children worth watching closely. An answer that the child welfare advocate on the panel later described, in her written assessment, as revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between a child who was simply introverted and a child who posed any kind of genuine concern. A misunderstanding that, left unchecked, made Nolan unsuited not just for school assignments, but for any role that required daily contact with children who processed the world differently than he did. The panel's final recommendation was not simple termination, though many parents at Lincoln Elementary, still shaken by what their own children had described seeing on the playground that day, had hoped for exactly that. But rather a permanent reassignment away from any role involving direct contact with minors, combined with 60 hours of mandated retraining, focused specifically on adolescent and child psychology, de-escalation techniques, and implicit bias. a resolution that Chief Reeves later admitted in a private conversation with Tyler's mother felt to him like an uncomfortable compromise between accountability and the practical reality that removing every officer who had ever made a serious mistake would leave entire precincts unstaffed. Though he was careful to add that the retraining would be followed by close, ongoing supervision, and that a second incident of any similar kind would end Nolan's career in law enforcement entirely, without further debate. In the meantime, the story of what had happened at Lincoln Elementary had already begun spreading well beyond the school's own community. First, through the 26-second video Renata Cole had recorded, which a parent had shared on a neighborhood social media group with a simple caption asking whether this was really what the new school resource officer program was supposed to look like. And then, within days, through local news coverage that picked up the story after the district's own internal review became a matter of public record. Coverage that focused less on Officer Nolan specifically, and more on the broader question the incident had raised about how quickly a program built with good intentions could go wrong when the officers assigned to it arrived without any real preparation for the particular vulnerability of the population they were now responsible for protecting. A town hall meeting was held at Lincoln Elementary 2 weeks after the incident, packed well beyond its usual attendance, with parents who wanted answers. And Chief Reeves attended not as a spectator, but standing at the front of the cafeteria alongside Principal Whitfield, taking questions for nearly 2 hours from parents whose anger, in many cases, had nothing to do with him personally, but everything to do with the system that had, in their eyes, treated their children's safety and dignity as an afterthought behind budget lines and political timelines. And Reeves, rather than defending the program or deflecting the criticism, spent much of that evening simply listening, taking notes by hand in a small notebook, not unlike the one his own son carried, and promising at the end of the meeting that every officer assigned to a school in the district would undergo the same expanded training Nolan was now required to complete, not as a punishment retroactively applied, but as a baseline standard going forward, a promise the district's school board formally adopted into policy within the month, making Lincoln Elementary, almost by accident, the origin point for a reform that would eventually reshape how the entire district approached school-based policing. Tyler himself, throughout all of this, remained largely shielded from the broader public conversation his private humiliation had accidentally set in motion, his parents deliberately keeping the news coverage and the social media discussion away from him as much as they reasonably could. Though he was old enough to sense, in the careful, gentle way the adults around him began treating the subject, that something larger than his own bad afternoon had come out of it. And when he finally did see the video Renata Cole had recorded, shown to him by his mother only after she judged he was ready, and only with a long conversation beforehand about what had happened and why, his first reaction was not pride or vindication, but something quieter, a kind of surprised recognition at how small he looked in the footage, how young, and how it had not felt, in the moment itself, anything like the version people online seemed to be discussing, a distinction that stayed with him long after the immediate attention around the incident faded, teaching him something about the gap between how an event feels from inside it and how it looks from the outside once it has been captured, shared, and turned into a story other people told without him. His father made a point, in the weeks that followed, of never once framing what had happened as a triumph, refusing interview requests that wanted to cast the story as a heartwarming tale of a police chief swooping in to rescue his son, insisting instead, whenever he did agree to speak publicly about it, that the real story was not about him at all, but about every child in every school across the district who did not happen to have a parent with a badge and the standing to walk into that hallway and be believed immediately. Children who deserved exactly the same protection and the same benefit of the doubt that Tyler had received purely by circumstance. An argument he made so consistently and so pointedly in every public statement that it eventually became the actual policy language written into the district's revised training manual, a sentence that read, almost verbatim from something Chief Reeves had said at that crowded town hall meeting, that every child in this district is entitled to the same dignity regardless of whose son or daughter they happen to be. Priya Anand, for her part, was quietly promoted the following semester into a newly created role focused on student well-being and de-escalation support, a position the district created specifically in response to what had happened, built around the recognition that a trained adult presence, empowered and expected to intervene rather than defer, might have stopped the entire incident before it ever reached the point of a torn notebook and a crying child. And Priya took the role seriously in a way that colleagues later described as almost fierce, making it a point, in her new capacity, to personally check in with every teacher's aide and every resource officer at every school she was assigned to about exactly the kind of moment she had once let slip past her out of uncertainty about her own authority, determined that no other adult standing nearby would ever again wonder, even for a few costly seconds, whether it was truly their place to step in. As for Tyler, by the following spring the whole episode had settled, in his own daily life at least, into something closer to memory than headline, and he could most days be found exactly where he had always been found, in the same corner of the garden behind the gymnasium, notebook open on his knees, sketching whatever version of the tomato plants or sunflowers happened to catch his eye that particular afternoon, the torn page still there near the front of the notebook, worn soft at its damaged edge from being turned past so many times, a small and permanent reminder, kept not out of anger, but out of something closer to gratitude, of the one afternoon when the whole world had seemed determined to make him feel small over nothing at all, and one person had simply knelt down in the dirt beside him and made sure, without ever needing to raise his voice, that he never had to feel that way again. There was, in the months that followed, one more thread of the story that rarely made it into any of the news coverage or the town hall discussions. A quieter thread that unfolded almost entirely within the walls of the Reeves household, and that Angela Reeves, Tyler's mother, would later describe as the part of the whole ordeal that had actually kept her awake at night, more than the video or the headlines or the parents who stopped her in the grocery store to ask if she had heard what happened to the chief's boy. In the first week after the incident, Tyler had trouble sleeping, waking twice in the middle of the night, convinced he had heard someone in the hallway outside his room. And though he never said so directly, Angela recognized the particular shape of that fear, having seen it before in patients at the hospital where she worked. The way a single frightening encounter with someone in a position of authority could quietly recalibrate a child's entire sense of who was safe to trust and who was not. And she made the decision, without consulting her husband first because she knew he would agree anyway, to bring Tyler to see a child therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of experience. Not because anything was fundamentally wrong with her son, but because she believed, as a matter of principle, that a child should never have to carry an experience like that entirely alone, simply because the adult in the story had ultimately been held accountable. The therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Elaine Voss, who had spent years working with children who had experienced frightening encounters with authority figures of all kinds, met with Tyler weekly for the better part of 2 months, and in one of their earliest sessions, according to notes Angela was shown much later, with Tyler's own permission, Tyler had said something that stuck with everyone who eventually heard it, telling Dr. Voss that the worst part had not actually been the moment Officer Nolan tore the page or held the notebook out of reach, but the several seconds before that, when he had looked around the playground at all the other kids and all the other adults nearby, and realized that no one, for those first few seconds, was going to say anything at all. A realization that had taught him something about how quickly a room full of people could become a room full of witnesses instead of a room full of people willing to help. A lesson Dr. Voss noted was unfortunately not unique to Tyler's situation, but was, in her clinical experience, one of the most common and most lasting injuries children carried away from public humiliation of any kind. Worse, in many cases, than the humiliation itself. Working through that particular fear became the central focus of much of their work together, not through any dramatic breakthrough, but through slow, patient practice. Dr. Voss teaching Tyler small techniques for noticing when he felt that same freezing, exposed sensation return, whether at school or anywhere else, and helping him build language for asking for help in the moment, rather than waiting, as he had waited that October afternoon, for someone else to notice on his own. By the following January, Tyler no longer needed weekly sessions, though he continued seeing Dr. Voss once a month through the rest of the school year. And Angela would later say that watching her son slowly regain his ease at school, watching him return to the garden not out of a need to hide, but simply because he still loved it, was a far better measure of whether justice had actually been done than anything that appeared in a disciplinary report or a news segment. Chief Reeves, for his own part, carried a version of that same reckoning with him long after the department's formal review had concluded, and colleagues who worked closely with him in the years that followed noticed a subtle but consistent shift in how he approached every subsequent complaint that crossed his desk involving an officer and a minor. A shift toward treating even minor, unsubstantiated complaints with the same seriousness he wished someone had shown toward that old, half-forgotten file on Officer Nolan 2 years before it ever reached his own son. A policy change he implemented quietly through revised internal review procedures rather than through any public announcement, because he had come to believe, in the aftermath of watching his own son cry in the dirt over a torn notebook, that the real failure had never been any single officer's temper, but the slow, cumulative permission an entire system had extended to that temper over the better part of 2 decades before. Anyone with the standing to stop it finally happened to be standing close enough to see it for himself. 2 years later, when Tyler was 13 and had moved on to middle school, a local paper doing a retrospective piece on how the district's school resource officer program had evolved since its rocky beginning reached out to the Reeves family for comment. And Tyler, old enough by then to have some say in how his own story was told, agreed to a short, carefully limited interview on the condition that the reporter focus on the garden rather than on the incident itself. An interview in which he talked at length about a new project he had started that spring, teaching younger students at his old elementary school how to sketch the plants in the same garden bed where he had once sat alone. A small after-school program Principal Whitfield had helped him set up, specifically because she remembered, more clearly than almost anyone, exactly what that particular corner of the playground had once meant to him, and exactly how much it still seemed to mean to him now that he had chosen entirely on his own, to spend his own free afternoons passing that same quiet, patient love of small growing things onto a new group of kids who had never heard of Officer Craig Nolan, and never needed to, because by then the notebook, torn page and all, sat not in Tyler's backpack anymore, but on a shelf in his room, no longer something he carried with him every day, but something he kept anyway, a small, permanent reminder that had slowly, over 2 years, stopped being about the worst afternoon of his childhood and started being about something else entirely, about the particular, unshakable feeling of watching his father cross a stretch of grass without raising his voice and kneel down in the dirt to make sure he was all right, before doing anything else at all. Renata Cole, who had recorded those original 26 seconds of footage without ever intending for it to become anything more than a private record she kept in case anyone ever asked what really happened that afternoon, was invited, along with Priya Anand, to speak at a regional education conference the following autumn on a panel about bystander intervention in school settings. And though she had never once thought of herself as any kind of advocate or expert on the subject, she found herself telling a room full of teachers and administrators from a dozen different districts the same simple observation she had carried with her since that October day: that the difference between a moment that turns into a lasting wound and a moment that turns into a lesson almost always comes down to how quickly the adults nearby decide that it is, in fact, their place to step in, and that waiting for certainty about whether a situation warrants intervention is itself often the very thing that allows the situation to become one. An observation that several attendees later told her they carried back to their own schools and repeated to their own staff. A small ripple spreading outward from one torn notebook page in ways that neither Renata nor anyone else involved that afternoon could have predicted, when it was all still happening in real time on a sunlit playground behind a gymnasium in a modest working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city. Years later, when people who had once lived near Lincoln Elementary tried to explain to newcomers why the school garden behind the gymnasium was treated with something close to reverence by staff and students alike, why a simple bed of tomato plants and sunflowers had its own small wooden sign now, hand-painted by a graduating class in gratitude to a program that had quietly reshaped how officers across the entire district were trained to speak to children. They rarely reached first for the disciplinary hearing, or the policy reforms, or even the video that had once traveled so quickly through the neighborhood's social media groups, but instead for the simpler image underneath all of it: a father crossing a stretch of grass without raising his voice, kneeling in the dirt beside his son and asking, before anything else in the world mattered, whether he was all right. A small and ordinary act of attention that turned out, in the end, to be the most powerful thing anyone in that story ever did. And it was that single image, more than any headline or hearing or policy binder that followed it, that people carried with them longest, because it reminded them of something so simple it was easy to forget in the noise of everyday life: that the measure of a person holding real power was never how loudly they could command a room, but how gently they could kneel down in front of a frightened child and make the whole world stop, if only for a moment, to ask if he was all right, before anything else in the world ever mattered more.